That's Cream and Lloyd, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Which basically did loads of work for the Unilevers and the Marses and all sorts of people.
Yes.
And then after that, set up Great British Chefs, did that for 8-9 years along. Then went to Hearst, so all the big magazine brands, Men's Health, Women's Health, Runner's World, Good Housekeeping, etc. Running their client division. And then, which basically, so working with brands to help them access the data, the reach, the scale, the brands, everything they could do. So we work with everyone from BMW to L'Oreal. Right. So working at the forefront of basically brand investment into a publisher, right? And they're obviously one of the biggest publishers in the world. And then lost a couple of parents. So basically it's called Stage of Life, sadly. So mum died from motor neurone, father died of cancer, and we were just like, drop Mike out. My wife and I went traveling with the kids for 6 months around Latin America.
Whereabouts?
We did Mexico and Argentina, mainly. We dropped into Belize and Guatemala and Uruguay. But
I'm going to Colombia.
we did Colombia many years ago. It's a great place. Very close.
In December, actually.
It's great. I love Colombia. I think we went there in 2011. No, 2012. We're in 2012.
To Colombia?
Yeah. What was so good about Colombia?
I just think it's a bit... Particularly in 2012, it was off the beaten track, right? No one went to Colombia unless you were kind of, psychotic. And it was just interesting. So, yes, we spent time in Latin America and then came back. And now I'm kind of doing that classic sort of portfolio career thing whereby I do advising, investment and consultancy into the world of food and drink. So brands like Botivo, who I don't know if you've come across, but who are completely amazing. Fern and Rosie, Denzel's, and Youngbug. So the insect guys.
Because I think the insect thing is going to be...
Have you been to their restaurant?
No, restaurant?
Yeah, they've got a pop-up.
Oh, no, I didn't.
I can try. It's only open this week, so if you want to try and go along, I can try and get you at least a taster of what it is. It's really interesting.
So is Youngbug a retail brand or is it a restaurant?
It's at the moment into restaurant business, so be food service business, but ultimately we'll go into retail.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's back, and there's a crew of. So I basically invest and advise on things in the food and drink industry because that's my specialty. But obviously with a bent on digital, because I built a digital brand that had 1 million followers, and was kind of one of the early kind of digital.
Well, we'll talk about it when we jump in, but I think something happened in the zeitgeist around. I was just saying to the lady outside in like 2009, 2010 with food in the UK. Mm-hmm. You started Great British Chefs. Is one thing, because I think you know how it's so pardon the pun, in vogue now to like be a chef, hipsters. But I think you were the first kind of person really pushing that with Great British Chefs. So you had that. You had the age of social media and Instagram and Facebook becoming. Yep. You had do you know a guy called Charlie McVeigh who did Draft House? He was kind of responsible for the craft beer movement, really.
Okay.
So you had 2009 is Brewdog, 2011 is Camden Town Brewery, 2013 is Beavertown.
Yeah.
So you had that movement start. And I'm trying to think what else. Great British Menu really kicked off, I think, in 2010. I know it was a bit earlier than that, but I think 2010.
My sister series produces it.
Oh, amazing! Yeah, your sister produces it.
Series producer. She's a series producer.
Oh, well, it's one of my favourite shows.
Yeah. So she's done the last 4 series. So she did MasterChef, won a BAFTA for MasterChef Professionals, I think. She won a BAFTA for one of them, and now she does Great British Menu. She lives in Oxford. So she's my younger sister.
Oh, amazing! Yeah, well, they're both my 2 favourite programmes.
Yeah. So.
But yeah, it did feel, and then the other thing that's what I was saying is 2011 is Roger Wade. He's been on this podcast. Opens Box Park in Shoreditch.
Yeah.
So the amalgamation of those 5 sort of things happening, and then it's like now where we are 10 years down the line, it's like food is,
and it's somewhere very different. I think I do think it's very interesting, kind of tracing the where Michelin star food has come to, where premium food has come to, the kind of the sort of fast casual dining movement, like what people want, what people cook at home, the internationalization we've seen. But I mean, that's what I've done for that. So food and marketing and digital are my 3 kind of things, really.
Yeah. Because what I'm trying to do with this is build like a media company, because I think the way I think podcasts are the way forward. Well, you know, we'll talk about your podcast. I listened to the episode you did with Marcus last night. Actually, it was really good. But I think that is the next frontier, really, of where it's going personally. But
very hard. We can have a long conversation about that.
Yeah.
But that's a very interesting conversation. The world of media. It's literally like, if there was one thing I wouldn't do nowadays, to start a media company. But that's a different conversation.
Yeah, but no, let's talk about that. Let's talk about
Do you know why it is? That, you know,
we may as well we're recording, so we may as well just jump in. I think that this seems, I've got, you know, the way these work, super relaxed conversation.
Yeah, no,
we'll go for quite a while. They're quite long.
Yep.
There's no kind of, I've got a few things written down. We'll just wax lyrical. But yeah, so why wouldn't you build a media company out of interest?
I mean, look, I think media companies are very complicated to monetize, and that's fundamentally based upon the fact that the main monetization route for media companies is advertising. Now, there are, you know, deep brand partnerships, there are e-commerce, and there are very successful, I think, B2B media companies. But in the B2C space, I think it is extremely difficult because of the sheer scale of some of the large digital players and the ability to target at an absolutely, you know, razor sharp level nowadays. And I just think that corporations, you know, look, you take the great media companies of today, let's say for me, The Guardian and the New York Times being two kind of standout examples. It's super difficult to monetize them. They've both done a really, really good job, but it's really hard because you spend a huge amount of money on journalists, you spend a huge amount of money on content, you spend a huge amount of money on technology, and a lot of consumers want it for free. And so how you monetize that is extremely difficult. I mean, look, Great British Chefs was a B2C. You know, we ran at kind of a couple of million uniques a month. We were, you know, followed by 1 million people across all our social media channels. We were, you know, had early partnerships with Microsoft and Google and Pinterest and others, and, you know, did some extraordinary early stuff in the digital space. But it's very difficult to monetize a niche audience. We did a really good job of it, but if you're building this because you're passionate about it, that's one thing. But if you're trying to build it to flip it, I think it's very difficult. There are less and less successful, you know, exit stories in the media landscape.
So with this, I'm trying to build it more like a B2B play.
Yeah, which I think is easier.
So I don't like, ultimately, I just I kind of started with the passion, loved doing it. And I was like, okay, well, if I can monetize my flow state and my freedom, i.e. be able to go to Colombia, and that seems good. It's whether I want it to be like a big thing that you sell on. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And look, do I think you can build a lifestyle business in the media landscape 100%? And do I think there are some successful, you know, B2B businesses? You know, William Reed is the big one, you know, in the food space, right? In terms of what they've got in terms of the grocer and you know, other properties. But it's the media landscape is very, very difficult, you know, and I think, you know, even if you look at, you know, a lot of the brands that have been on this podcast and their choice of how they build those brands, often it's through social media. That's where they spend their money. And then they reach a tipping point where they may start to explore outdoor. They may then start to explore, you know, TV or some form of digital version of TV, and then maybe there's radio further down the line. But, you know, actually a lot of media money goes into social and digital nowadays, and the targeting in that space is extraordinary if you understand it and you know how to kind of capitalize on it.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Honestly, means the absolute world to me. I'd be so grateful for a small favour, please. It is so hard growing a YouTube channel. It is so bloody hard. If you please enjoy these videos, just click the subscribe button. More subscribers equals bigger guests equals better conversations, and hopefully you can learn more as you build your food and drink brand. Thank you so much.
I think to begin with, as I said, 2010, 2011 was this inflection tipping point where kind of the stars aligned and everything sort of amalgamated into this moment in time, and I think it really exploded this new food movement. So as I was saying, you had Great British Menu becoming more popular. I think the first series was like 2006, but then it really started to gain legs 2010. You had Box Park open street food 2011. The birth of social media. You started Great British Chefs, which made, in my opinion, the access to the stories behind the chefs were much richer, which then made the experience at a restaurant more enjoyable. Didn't feel as far away. But I'd love to kind of go. So you've got this inflection point. I'd love to go back, maybe in the 10 years pre that. Could you paint a picture of the food scene in the UK? Say what was a typical Thursday night in 2003, 2002. Like, where would you go? What were the options?
So 2002, I was living in Manhattan and living in New York. So I started my career at Unilever. So I spent the first few years in the UK, but then was lucky enough to spend 3.5 years traveling around the States, working on Unilever's biggest home and personal care brands and notching up, I think, 32 of the American states while I did it. So a typical Thursday night might find me in deepest Illinois eating in some strange restaurant off the beaten track. But I think what was interesting about the early parts of that period was that London was gaining in its culinary confidence, right? So I think, if I go back into my childhood, I mean, I'm, few years older than you. So the fact is that I remember, the days when places like, Quaglino and Mezzo's were kind of the ultimate restaurants in London, which were kind of, the Conran industry, right? Which was, the amazing restaurants of early 2000s. I think those were the sort of the businesses that suddenly made food interesting and cool. And then, but there wasn't the choice that there is now. And I think there came a point suddenly where, as you say, in sort of 2009, 2010, food suddenly became super interesting and super cool. And I mean, God, it's been on a journey since then. But I think those early days, there just wasn't quite the choice back in, sort of the turn of the century, which just felt a long time ago. It is almost a quarter of a century ago. But I think then suddenly it began to become more interesting, more international, us getting closer to Europe, more money in London, in terms of international money, therefore new cuisines coming in, people pushing boundaries, an interest, I think, in provenance and creativity in the kitchen, and people being prepared to pay for that.
So you're in the States. Like, what was talk to me about that quickly, because I think that's fascinating. You did 32 of the states. What state changed the way you view the world in the UK?
So I think what was interesting, so weirdly, my dad was half American, was fully American, so I'm half American. And so I didn't know America before I went out there. And I was living in New York. Our office was in Connecticut, but working for Unilever, obviously they're sold in every supermarket across the country. So I spent literally 3 years traveling around America, trying to help brands grow in specific retailers.
What brands?
So I worked on the launch of Axe Links in North America. Mm-hmm. I worked on the launch of Dove Hair and Dove Face, which was a disaster in North America. I basically was at the forefront of retail marketing in partnership with Unilever's biggest brands, and trying to, because America's so big, you actually need to customize the mix for specific retailers. So unlike the UK, where broadly speaking, every single thing you sell is the same, in America, you might have a different offering for Costco, for Target, for Walmart, for Dollar General, for Family Dollar, for all the different retailers. So we were working at sort of helping brands understand how they work with retailers. So, I mean, what changed my relationship, I suppose, more actually with the US is you suddenly realize how diverse the US is, and how when you're down in Arkansas, how it is a completely different country to when you are, up in Seattle with Costco and, the founding place of Starbucks. It's a very complicated country. And I think a lot of food brands from the UK think, oh yeah, we can do America. And I always take a deep breath and go, yeah, do you know how complicated that country is? And one state is the size of the UK.
So I actually went over to, funnily enough, Connecticut to interview Athletic Brewing,
right? Which
is, I mean, they've actually cracked every state. They're basically the Lucky Saint in the States. Huge brand, amazing founders. And one of the questions I was asking them is how do brands crack the States? and they were kind of like, well, they didn't say mate, it's not a very American word, but they were just kind of like, proceed with caution. It's a very incongruous beast. And I think people in the UK naively just see America as New York and LA, and potentially San Francisco. And actually there's a whole thing in the middle of America, which makes it so complicated. When you said you had to change the marketing mix per brand, could you go into that a bit further and like give an example? Because I think I know some listeners who in fact, they're mates of mine, like I won't say who it is, but they're like, yeah, we're going to crack America and there's a huge amount of volume there. It's like...
So picking up on your point about the States, one of the things that I always remember blew my mind in America, and then when I was based in Asia after that, blew my mind to the next level when I went to China, was when you land in a state or a city you've probably never heard of in America, right, which happens to be a regional kind of important city in a state, right? And you arrive and there are 5 or 6 skyscrapers, right? And you kind of go, what are these massive towers doing in the middle of the city? And you realize that in every state, there is someone or some business that has built something extraordinary that you have no idea about, right? Because actually that state might be 50, 60 million people. And these are big ponds, right? With big successful stories. So for you to walk into, like a state like Arkansas, right, where Walmart is based.
Where's Arkansas?
South. So it's where Bill Clinton was governor before he was president. It's where Walmart's head office is. And there are more private jets in the old days that used to leave Arkansas Airport every day because they were all the Walmart executives going out to their stores than any other city in America. And you suddenly have to take this deep respect for the complexity. I mean, so talking about customization. So when we launched Axe in North America, I was responsible for building the customer marketing plan, so the plan that we put into individual retailers. And I think the way that, at that point, brands thought you launched this kind of broadcast story. It's like, this is our tale. And actually what we realized very quickly is if you wanted to get retailer buy-in, you need to build customized plans by retailer. And that meant that, for example, at Walmart, everyone probably, your listeners can think of an Axe Links advert of, something crazy happening and, girls and guys going nuts and that kind of young teenage thing. We built an ad in Walmart. We actually shot an ad in Walmart in order to make the Walmart team buy into what we were doing. We created specific packs for different retailers with different fragrances, different on-pack promotions. So because each retailer is so big, Dove is probably 150 million there, right? Maybe more. It's probably more now. One retailer might be 30, 40 million. Right. So you take that business seriously and you invest to make it work. So it's just a very different market. And it taught me tremendous respect for retailers and tremendous respect as a marketeer for how you needed to work really hard to make your story win at shelf. Because it's one thing to have a really successful TV campaign that everyone loves or loads of social media following. But when you walk into retail, actually, why do people choose your brand unless you win at shelf?
How do you tell the story on shelf to win at shelf? Go and unlock that door a bit more, because I think it's fascinating how... I think you're so right. I interviewed Jamie Lang and Ed Williams from Candy Kittens. Mm-hmm. Done an amazing job with that brand. Mm-hmm. They were like, just because Jamie's got 2 million followers, we've got loads of followers on social media. It gets you to a point, but ultimately means fuck all in the grand scheme of things. It's like, doesn't mean we can tell our story on shelf. People don't know who Jamie Lang is in Asda in Scotland, for example. I think that's fascinating. How can brands tell their story on shelf?
I think one of the advantages with, spending 8-9 years at Unilever is it forces you to go through the rigor of proper brand marketing and make choices. And when you think about on-shelf communication, too often I see brands that have put on pack 10 or 12 different claims, 10 or 12 different, like, oh yes, we're vegan and we're a B Corp and we have no palm oil and we are low calorie and we have more of this and more of that and less of this. And you're eventually like, okay, yeah, but what's the reason why I should buy you? And I always remember I had a brilliant first marketing director who I remember going in for the very first time to present my creative brief that I was going to give to JWT to produce my first ad.
JWT, sorry.
J. Walter Thompson.
Right.
part of WPP. And he just did this kind of, he just wrapped the table. He was like, and I'm like, what, John? He's like, knock on the door test. Knock on someone's door. What are you saying? And I said something. He goes, nope, knock on the door again. And it was a kind of a realization that if you knock on the door and someone opens the door and you say, what are you going to say? What is your opening line? And I think as a brand. And what he was forcing us to do was to reduce all of our communication, all of the kind of puff of like, oh, we do this, we do that, we do the other, to like, but hang on, what is the one thing you're trying to do? What's the one story you're trying to tell? And I do think that the brands that are successful have a singular story. That doesn't mean they may not be doing a million things under the cover. They may be doing ticking boxes in lots of really important areas, but you need a story that someone can understand. And, you know, it was funny, in the car on the way to school this morning, my children, I was talking to them. It was Thought for the Day on Radio 4. And someone told a parable. And my daughter, who is 7, said, what's a parable? And I said, well, a parable is a story that allows people to remember something that's important. And I actually think that brands forget that at times. And I think what you work out when you get to retail, bring us back to where this started, was actually you are at shelf and you've kind of got one message you've got to give. You've got to convince someone to go pick up. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a back of pack where you engage with the story, but what's that one message that you think is going to make people choose you rather than the 35 other candies that happen to be sitting at the Shell petrol station checkout? You know,
I was writing in my newsletter this morning about this, and I talked to, I interviewed last week William Kendall, who did Green and Blacks and Newcomb Garden Soup. And the analogy I'm using is don't forget the cake is the cake, i.e. not the icing, which is the B Corp, the fair trade, the whole smorgasbord of different, like, we're this. Like, they are great, but they're not the cake. Like, are you a chocolate cake? Are you a red velvet cake? Are you a Victoria sponge? Like, what's the one thing you are? And all these other things you can put on top. But I think so many brands get focused so much on the icing, all these other bits, that they forget what the cake is or what the story is at shelf. Like, don't forget the cake is the cake.
But to stick with your cake analogy, I think it's true you need to think about what cake are you, and are you a good, you know, chocolate sponge? Are you a good Victoria sponge? Are you a good, you know, Black Forest Gatto, whatever it happens to be? But you then need to work out how you're making yourself different. And I think, you know, if we return to the world of you know, high-end food, where I spent a fair amount of time, the great dishes can be incredibly simple. And often the dishes that fail, you know, you hear it on MasterChef, you hear it on lots of TV programs. There's just too much going on here, right? And actually, there are real parallels between a great plate of food and a great brand, is that you see it, it's got visual impact, you know, you kind of know what you're going to get, but then it surprises you and it intrigues you and it's interesting and it kind of, you want it again. And I think brands have that same challenge in retail, right? Which is to intrigue someone enough to order it, to pick it up, but then to deliver on the promise and go one stage further such that people will come back and keep engaging.
Yeah, this is why this is why I'm so excited to you, because we have similar wild passions for both food and brands, I think, in equal measure. And I think there's a lot of the parallels between both are super interesting. Have you heard of the brand All Things Butter?
Yes, very interesting.
I interviewed Tom. I interviewed both founders, Tom and Toby, last week. So Tom's the chef. He's got the restaurant in Notting Hill. Toby's the brand guy who actually worked at Trip. And I was like, oh, what are the parallels? And Tom was saying exactly, I said, what's the definition of creativity was the question. And Tom was like, creativity is taking away. It's less is more. And then Toby was like, it's the same with the branding, like a brand on shelf. And the more you think about it, and the amount of brands, even when with the brand I do a bit of work with at the minute, Islands Chocolate, we were just trying to do so much on that, to tell that knock on the door. It's like, we're a chef chocolate, we're healthy. We're also from a lost already before we've tried to say 10 things at once. I think your knock kind of who's there is super interesting. What are some of the brands that you think do this really well, that tell the story in the challenger brand space really well on shelf? And just, hey guys, absolutely buzzing that Mackenzie Jones are extending their partnership with Hungary. So gassed. In case you have been living under a rock, who are Mackenzie Jones? They are FMCG recruitment specialists. They work with some amazing brands, Lucky Saint, Real Superfoods, Hunter and Gather, and Purdy and Fig. Also with some of the big papas, the big boys, the big G's, PepsiCo, Unilever, Campari. I've known Billy for yonks, Paul for last year. He's a top bloke. They're just super kind and lovely, and they're just dedicated to our wonderful space, our wonderful industry of buccaneering challenger brands. And look, there's so much more than recruitment business. Check out the podcast we did with them. It's epic. I've even introduced Mackenzie Jones to some amazing brands, and they've really helped them scale. If you're looking to hire, just reach out to them, have a chinware, get in touch, do yourself a favour. Thank you. Guys, are you ready? There is going to be some absolutely, totally, brilliantly bonkers next level madness coming your way today. Are you ready to take your brand to a whole new stratosphere for free? Imagine connecting your product to a digital world through a simple smartphone scan. You know the drill, scan it, bish bash bosh, you're away. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the magic of the new GS1 powered QR codes. These next generation barcodes act as a gateway to a world of endless possibilities. They connect your product's unique identity to multiple online sources of enriched real-time content. Why on planet Earth should you be getting your mitts on these GS1 powered QR codes? Well, look, very, very simple, mate. GS1 will help you drive revenue, upsell and cross-sell your amazing products, boost your bottom line. Yes, please. Where do I sign? Enhance customer engagement. Look, delight your customers with dynamic content that captivates and keeps them coming back for more. Please, sir, can I have some more? Yes, you can. Comply with regulations. Look, you want to be building your brand. You don't want to be knee-deep, wading through a deep river of legislation, aggravation. These barcodes allow you to stay ahead of the curve. Look, don't allow this beautiful boat of boundless opportunity to sail away into the molting sunset. Be on that boat. Join GS1's UK's free pilot program today. Yes, it's completely free. There will be a link in the show notes. Thank you so much.
I mean, the truth, I think, is that the retail environment at the moment is so competitive. I mean, I think there are... It's funny, I will answer your question.
Yeah,
I went to Specialty Fine Food the other day, and I walked around and I just thought, my God, there are so many brands here that are great quality, that are delicious, that are interesting, that the founder is trying to do the right thing. But God, I'm scared how many of them are going to not succeed. Because when you come to shelf, you know, your candy kitten thing is... I remember just walking into a petrol station over the weekend and just seeing all of the candy and all of the choices, and then you've got all the healthy snacks, and then you've got, you know, fruit and in the end you want one snack. Like, how do you get that single choice? Brands, I think, are doing it really well at shelf. I think is very category specific, right? So I think different categories have different challenges. There are some categories where I think it's a complete war zone, and I think snacking and the sweet market, I think, is a complete war zone. I think snacking is a war zone. I think the ready-to-drink category is terrifying. There's certain categories that just terrify me, right? Because there is millions of great products out there, and in the end, it is kind of an arms race of who can muscle their way in to getting the big distribution, getting enough consumer attention, and staying there. Because there's so many brands that, you know, appeared and now, you know, like Sunny Delight, great example, massive launch of Procter & Gamble's, right? Isn't even here anymore. You know, you draw up the list of brands that actually have gone by the wayside, and it's enormous, you know, and I think that is, and brands that lose relevance and brands that just kind of, you know, somehow don't make it. So come on, who do I think is doing it well? I think Pip and Nut are doing it very well. I think it's a really... it's a very complicated category with a lot of competition, but I think they do a really nice job of telling a very clear and coherent story about what they are and what they offer. I think that Schwartz are doing some interesting work at the moment, the Spices brand.
Schwartz, I don't know if I know them.
So that they are, if you open so you see, they're a really interesting one, right? Actually, they are the Spices brand that everyone has in their cupboard. what brands of spices.
Is that Bart's?
Bart's is an emerging competitor who again launched back in the time of Great British Chefs. Was actually our first client, weirdly. But Schwartz, I just saw that they'd done a relationship with Bake Off winner, and they're doing interesting mixes, and they're trying to push the whole kind of foodie agenda, and they've got a very complicated commodity category, right, where they're starting, I think, to do more interesting things in terms of mixes. Who else I was seeing, I think in the beer space, I think Lucky Saint are doing a great job of incredibly kind of clear communication and a really solid product. I think actually some of the new innovation that's come out of Brewdog, I think is really, really interesting. And I think as usual, it's sort of combative and different. I think things like the alt meat category is just a total war zone. And terrifies me in terms of the level of price promotion and the number of brands that are desperately trying to play, backed by huge VC money. I think that Tony's Chocolonely is doing a really good job of disrupting the chocolate category and actually doing interesting stuff in that space. I mean, there's so many. You could go on for ages of like different brands that are breaking rules and are creating.
But I think if we go back a step, if we thread the needle between all those brands, Tony's, Pip and Nut, I would add Trip to the mix.
Yes, I think they're interesting.
They do two things. One, they know what their cake is.
Yeah. They do.
As much as Pip's B Corp, I think Trip are B Corp, but it's not their leading message. No. First thing. Second thing is when they do the knock, you know exactly who they are.
Exactly.
And I think the third thing, back to what you said so well, or what the kind of the analogy of the chef is that they've taken a lot away. Tony's is so complicated, but further down there's a lot of texture to that brand. But at shelf where they're telling the story, it's really simple. I interviewed the founder of Who Gives a Crap.
Mm-hmm. Great company.
Another example. Yeah. He talked, and he's just this Aussie guy who lives by the beach. We did it on Zoom, but he was saying a brand is like a human being. It's multi-textured, so it's like, you may see me when I open that door. You may see that brand when I open that door. It's like, this is what I do. But over time, you get to know people. You have this multi-textured. And he was basically saying, if you're just purpose, which is because they're a philanthropic brand, they do, help give away half their profits to charities. You become too boring. Become that person at the dinner party who's just harps on about the same thing. And he's like, Who gives a crap? We want to have these layers of texture. So I think it's really interesting what you've said there.
And I think that's very hard for brands to work out, which is, let's take sustainability, right, as what I would call, a table stake nowadays. Like that's part, the thing is, it's not just one cake. And that's the problem in some ways with the analogy is that, if you are a brand, there are certain boxes you nowadays have to tick if you want to have a long-term credible future, right? And for me, sustainability is one of those, right? It may not be your central message, right? But you sure as hell need to work out where you stand on sustainability, where you stand on, sourcing ingredients, where you stand on kind of loads of the questions around identity, right? You need to know those things. They may not be your story, but if you get them wrong, everything implodes. And I think that is where I think some of the sort of startup challenger brands get tripped up, is because they're passionate about a category. They're passionate about changing that category. But I think at times one can lose focus on what is the story that you're telling and how is it that you're creating a brand that is going to engage with consumers. What's the hook, right? And I think at times we forget, I know you've gone on a lot about, that the UK is not America and, brands need to think beyond the kind of the exit, which I completely agree with. And I think there is this trick we need to remember that actually the UK is nowhere near as affluent as America. And we do not spend anything like the amount of money on our regular grocery shops. We have very different houses. We have very different eating patterns. We spend money very differently. And therefore, I think there is occasionally this danger that brands think there's a super premium opportunity, which may exist where we're sitting, right, in the outskirts of the square mile, but doesn't exist in in middle of the UK. And I think there is a challenge around, credibly working out what is it you're offering, and are people prepared to pay more for that?
I think you're so right, and well, this is the last bit of the cake analogy, but I think, as you say, why it's becoming so convoluted for brands is because a bit like the sustainability is a layer of the cake, right? But it's like, and Union Coffee,
Yep.
they've done all these amazing things. They, Jeremy and his partner Stephen have gone to Colombia, funnily enough, Guatemala, really kind of fixed that supply chain. He was the guy who brought coffee to the UK, like back in the 80s. Started with like the Seattle Coffee Company, which they then sold on to Starbucks. And they did all these amazing things, all these layers. But ultimately, when the consumer was knocking on the door, those things didn't resonate. No. And as much as they want to tell that story, the thing that mattered on shelf was these two things. It was, what does it taste like? Mm-hmm. So they talk about caramel notes, and what's the strength? And then once they're through the door, then you can tell those stories. But it's fascinating for brands. I think what you're saying is less is more. I want to go back. I just love America and how we speak the same languages. We're so similar, but we're so wildly different. And that to me just fascinates me. You said right at the beginning, by working in 34 states, you had a deeper respect for retailers that you maybe didn't have before going to the States. What was that?
So I had a deeper respect for the difference in America, right? So this is back in 2001, 2, 3, 4 was when I was there. And I suppose it was the beginning of things like what was then called Hispanic marketing, right? Which is the fact that Unilever suddenly, and lots of brands suddenly woke up to the fact that actually you couldn't just market in English. One of the largest populations, primary language was Spanish. And actually you need to start to talk to the Hispanic population in an authentic and engaging and interesting way, which was completely, which felt like, whoa, what just happened, in that point. But I suppose what I got a sort of a real understanding of there was that, you can't build a marketing plan. And I think the same is true in some ways in the UK, in the US, for one consumer group, right? When you look at a brand and the opportunities that brand has, you need to work out by retailer, by occasion, what is it that the brand is offering and what is it that the brand needs to do. And the reality is that an occasion like walking into a Costco and buying 16 bars of Dove is very different to that mindset of like, I just need to stock up on my favorite soap, versus a dollar store where a consumer is going, I'd like a really premium soap and I'm prepared to spend $1 for it. And I want to, it feels like something special. It's a big light, someone who's on a lower income who's making careful choices about their money versus a high-end Costco consumer who's just stockpiling. Those are two very different shopping occasions. And I think the same is true with food brands, right? Which is you need to understand the mindset that someone goes shopping in and the occasion you're targeting and how you appeal to that moment. I mean, I'll give you an example of some of the work I'm doing at the moment. So I'm an investor and an advisor to a food brand, dog brand called Denzel's, right? Which is a kind of, I jokingly call them for shorthand, like the innocent of dog treats, right? So lots of personality, big on sustainability, big on flavors. They got kind of very cutesy kind of logo and design. The occasion that someone walks into a Tesco's and buys a thing of dog treats is fundamentally different to the moment where you're in a pub with your dog and they're sitting on the counter is the opportunity to buy some dog treats. How you message the brand in those two moments is quite different, right? One is not about price, right? Right? You're in the pub, you've just bought yourself a pint at whatever pounds, right? If you're in London, 7, if you're outside London, maybe less than 5, right? And you've bought that pint and you're with your dog and you're like, oh, let's give the dog, it's a different mindset, right? You want it to be fun. You want it to feel like it's a treat for the dog, right? Whereas you're in a supermarket and you're walking down the dog aisle and you're thinking, I must get some treats for my dog. Oh, which brands are there? What are the pricings? What's the offering, right? Completely different messaging. And I think, actually when brands think about, from a food perspective, human food here, actually how you communicate in a Tesco's versus an independent retailer or versus online, the stories you tell, the product offering you have, I think is actually quite different. And I think there's an opportunity to optimize it for those occasions. And I think that brands, yes, you need to work out what is the knock one thing you're doing, but there are different moments you're having to deliver the knock. The knock on social media is different to the knock at point of sale. It is different to the knock in a consumer event you're organising.
The linking this back to the brand as a human being, right? Is it's the way, I don't know why, maybe a crass way of saying this, but I think with that brand saying, oh, we're not going to change who we are just for the retailer. It's not about changing who you are. It's how you show up. So it's like the way I'll talk about my Ibiza trip, for example, right? To my nana, who's 85, is very different from the way I'm going to tell it to my mates at the pub. Still me talking, but it's the way you speak in those, as you say, optimized per retailer. And I think I think putting it down it's still showing up as the same brand, but telling the story ever so slightly. I'd love to go into,
and I think that analogy is completely correct, right? Which is, it is possible to be authentic to yourself, to be true to your values, to be true to who you are, right? But a kind of core fundamental, like, what are the things you care about? What are your red lines in the way that you interact with both strangers and close friends? And the values should be the same, but you'll behave differently to someone you've met the first time than someone you've known since you were 10, right? And actually, but they can both be the same person. They both have the same authenticity.
Let's talk about marketing. I mean, I wasn't even expecting us to go down these rabbit holes, so this is super enjoyable. So let's talk about marketing plans by retailer. And I think some of the big lessons you've taken from Unilever that are applicable to challenger brands, granted it is more complicated.
In the States, yeah.
Yeah, in the sense. But what are some of the lessons? Say someone's listening to this, they've got to go in and do a Waitrose marketing plan or a brand plan. What do you think are some of the principles of a great marketing plan?
Boemi, our beloved sponsor, are helping build the fastest growing challenger food and drink brands. Look, if you're a small brand just starting out and need your first indie stockist, your first 100 stockists to wholesale, Boemi are the platform to categorically speed that up. But if you're a big brand wanting to get bigger, Boemi are also insane. They make field sales marble smooth, silky slick. They're just epic. Ollie's been on this podcast twice, actually. They saw a 29% uplift in sales when using Boemi to check major malt listings availability. Insane. 29% uplift by downloading an app. Insane. Lucky Saint, my boy Aaron Duff, who's coming on this podcast in a couple of weeks, he uses it to manage a team of 30 people, and Lucky Saint have unlocked 500 draft listings by using Boemi. Look, you've got to get involved with this stuff. It's absolutely insane, and it will categorically change your life. It's just the sickest platform. I use it all the time at Islands. Hi guys, super quick one. So excited. Look, for years I've been badgering on about Hungry the podcast. You're probably bored to death. Thanks for putting up with me. But Hungry is also an agency, and we look after one amazing brand called Islands Chocolate. We've had a great time over the year. We've won listings at a load of wholesalers. We've won Milk and More. We've got our first grocery listing coming very soon, which is very sick. But what I'm thrilled to announce is Hungry is merging with HC Consulting. My boy Harry Clark and his wonderful team, he's an absolute G. They do brand strategy, new business and account management. But why I really love working with Harry and why we've got on so well over the last couple of months is Harry was actually the founder of the boozy isolate brand Pops. So he's been in the trenches, he's grafted his face off, he's had the sleepless nights, he's had the turmoil, he's had the triumph, he knows what it is to be a founder, he is a founder. And he's got a proven track record in grocery and out of home. Holy moly dips, the gut stuff, Savile drinks, Remio gelato. So if you're a brand and you're stuck, you're looking for like new business help, you're looking to scale, drop us a message, we'd love to chat. Thank you so much. Back to the old episode.
So I think the first thing to say is that the retailers are different, right? And while there are certain truisms, like basically everyone shops at Tesco's and pretty much everyone shops at the big retailers at some point, the core consumer group that is at different retailers and the core consumer group that retailer is targeting are different, right? Understanding your retailer, what their mission is, what they're about, and who they're targeting and how you fit into that story, right, is critical. Most buyers, I would say, want more insight into their category. And while lots of retailers have lots of big data on purchase behavior in store or, what's happening at the kind of top level, they might not understand the dynamics of what's actually happening within their category, right? So how are people shopping for that category in different retailers? What are the attitudes and the drivers of that category, right? So you as a brand owner, as a category expert, will probably and should know more about that category, the buyers that are turning up, the dynamics, the future trends, the interesting stuff that's there. Helping the buyers see how they can win in their category is the basis of that conversation. And then coming up with marketing tactics that will help you win with with that retailer is critical. The one caveat I would give is, I think without being cynical about this, one needs to remember that marketing in retailers is a profit center. Right?
Profit center.
They make money out of it, right? So in the end, do retailers make money out of milk? Not so much. Do they make money when you put an advert in, when they, put a whole bunch of shelf markers up or run advertising on, their TV network or advertise through their database? They make money out of that, right? So they want money from their suppliers to support their categories. So you have to be careful and make sure that what you're picking from the portfolio of offerings that come from the retailer are going to work, I'll say. But look, for me, the big lesson is that you've got to understand your retailer. You've got to then make sure that you're tailoring the mix to the shopper and the relationship that shopper will have with that category and your brand. If you're a highly established brand and you're trying to drive, large pack size, it's one strategy. If you're an emerging brand entering into a sleepy category that people have been shopping on autopilot for generations, you've got a different challenge.
Tell me the difference between the brand plan and the marketing plan, because I think brands get confused with that. And which one comes first, do you think?
Well, I'll start. So I think the difficulty on that is different people will call different things.
Right. Yeah.
I would start with, what is the strategy, right? What are the 4 or 5 things you're trying to do?
Yeah.
To kind of at a business level, what are the marketing objectives that sit underneath those business objectives?
Yeah.
Right? And how are we going to achieve that? So I always start with the classic question of, what are we trying to achieve, right? And I do think that too often you end up at a channel conversation like, we need to do social media. Why do we need to do social media? We need to do more kind of outdoor. Why do we do more outdoor? I think the question for brands must be, what are the jobs we need to do? What are the things we're trying to achieve? And then build the plan that achieve those. And one of the things that, anyone who's spent time in big corporations knows, the first thing that gets cut in any conversation is the marketing budget, right? Because it's a variable cost, right? You can't cut the factory, you can't cut the people. So actually it's much easier to kind of go, well, let's just stop that campaign. If your campaigns are built on a solid logic of what is the business objective, what are the marketing objectives to achieve those business objectives, and what are the channels we're going to achieve to ladder up, so to speak, then it's easier to get there. So I believe in starting, and I do quite a lot of work with the brands I work with on brand planning and on actually kind of building marketing plans, right, that come from clear strategies, is you've got to start with those fundamental business objectives. If one of the objectives is win at Tesco's, okay, right, what's the number? What's the objective? How are we going to measure it from a marketing perspective? And then what are we going to do to make that happen? And I think the whole thing for me about measurement and consumer insight is one of the areas that some challenger brands don't spend enough time thinking about. I'm a big believer in really getting close to your consumer and really understanding them.
Getting really close to your consumer and understanding them.
So I think, we were talking as we were grabbing a coffee beforehand about the danger of the kind of the London-centric food scene, right? In the end, yes, it's important to win in London, right? And what is it? 12, 13% of the UK. But actually, you've actually got to win at a Tesco's somewhere
Darlington,
between 2 towns, right? Or on the outskirts of town. Or Waitrose, in the middle of, name a county, right? Suffolk, right? I think in the end, when you own a brand or running a brand, what's really, really important is that you understand at a granular level, what do consumers think about your product, right? What do they think about your brand? What do they think about your competitive brand? What are their frustrations? And the reality is most brands have social media following. Most brands have databases, but not enough brands are asking questions of those consumers.
What questions should our listeners be asking to get more insight on their consumer base that could actually map upwards to achieve those objectives?
But I think if you start at the objectives and you work down, like if you've got clear marketing objectives, right? Which is,
sorry, when you say marketing objectives, so sorry for sounding like a Luddite here, but so you're basically saying do the brand plan first.
I'm saying do the business strategy first and then ladder that into marketing objectives and then communication objectives and then channel choice. Start at the absolute top of, we are trying to grow. Yeah. Let's say you've got a new innovation. So let's take a brand like Fern and Rosie, another brand I work with.
Perfect example.
So let's say Fern and Rosie want to launch a new variant of jam, right? Or let's say Fern and Rosie want to go into a new retailer, right? What's the financial target? Right, we're trying to achieve X 100,000, X million. How are we going to achieve that? What are we going to do to make that happen? And then you literally work through the line, which is like, what are the tactics from promotions to on-packs to media, to retailer media, to brand collaborations, to social, to deliver that objectives? Too often, I think brands go, okay, as a brand, what do I need? I need to be big on, Instagram and TikTok, and I need to have a website, I need to grow my database. Like, well, hang on, step back. What are we trying to do? Right? What are our actual business objectives? Therefore, what are our marketing objectives that come from those? And then how are we going to achieve those with what channels? And I think, lots of the big corporations are really good at putting in kind of big granular processes that take you through that brand planning cycle. And I do think that brands need to really begin their years. We enter into a new year with, sit down, do a SWOT, work out what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what are your opportunities, what are your threats? Where are the kind of opportunities for the brand that we want to win in? How are we going to achieve them? What are we going to spend to do it? And what channels do we need to support to make that happen? I think that kind of, that granular, God, it's boring. The brand planning process that you'd have to go through at Unilever was excruciating and it took months, right? But ultimately it gave you the rigor to make sure your plan stood up and you were doing things for the right reason.
It's fascinating how there's when this William Kendall was talking about this, brands go through this gestation period where founders are a bit, most founders are, not all, I want to make a caveat of this, they have this kind of, William called it a gestation period, and this almost scattiness, that ready, fire, rave, you're trying to find the product market fit. So it could be like, a lot of the brands I interview or founders I speak to, their initial idea isn't the idea that makes them famous. Completely. So you've got to throw a lot of shit at the wall, basically. The market will give you the feedback, and then you tailor. That works to a point. Mm-hmm. Maybe once you get into weight, that will get you into your Planet Organic, your Selfridges, your Harrods, Waitrose potentially. But then you get to another point, and I always say it's like a brand's like a toddler growing up, right? Mm-hmm. You get to a point where you can't be like that. You've got to sit down and have that rigor, and it is boring, but basic and boring, but it does take you to that next level. I think, to be honest, I'm not great at that bit. That bit of sitting down to do the actual planning, I don't find that interesting. But I think you're so right in terms of brands doing it. In terms of
you talked earlier about asking someone to define creativity. Creativity for me is about defining a framework and then breaking the rules within that framework. And I think that if someone says, just be creative. So I worked with What If Innovation, right, which was one of the leading innovation consultancies, now part of Accenture. And we used to go in to run brand processes with people like PepsiCo and Unilever and Procter & Gamble and Beiersdorf, all the big corporations, to help their brand people think creatively about a particular challenge. You would always fail in that process if the task up front was not defined well enough. If you were not clear about what are we trying to be creative about, what are the parameters around that process, you didn't have a hope in hell, right? And we used to, they always did a sort of, before any process, right, the first step was pause. in lots of the processes that Unilever had, be like what they've had. And it's like, okay, just stop and think for a second. What are we actually trying to do here? Once you've got that, go nuts, right? But if you're not clear on absolutely what you're trying to create, that sort of that rigor, you can't be creative. You have to have that constraint to then do that. And I'm a real, it's funny. It's not one of the things it's what Unilever changed about me. I did 2 degrees in art history. When I arrived at Unilever, I was one of the creative ones, was always on all the brainstorms, always doing all the kind of mad creative thinking, the breaking the rules, building campaigns, like getting Naomi Campbell to wear rubber gloves for a washing up liquid campaign, all sorts of crazy stuff. But, what Unilever taught me was if you don't get the rigor right at the front, God help you. And I think that is, the thing that really changed, me, as a kind of a human being, was understanding that need to kind of button things down before you kind of start getting creative.
So know the framework and then break it.
Yeah, break it and push it.
That's ultimately linking this back to chefs, right? Is like the framework of, so Tom gave the example of, I'm going to make a pork chop with potatoes. Mm-hmm. That's the framework. Yep. For example, I'm going to break the rules by doing X, Y, and Z. But Tom had to know if Tom had just had a plate, just a fucking plate, like a white plate. What's the frame? What are you trying to break? Any old shite could go on the plate, right? But when he knows pork chop potatoes, that framework allows you to break it and do something, create something new.
And I think that's the thing about cooking, right? Which is there are some fundamental tenets of cooking.
Yeah.
And every time that I've ever had the honor of standing alongside during a broadcast or whatever it is with a top chef, what makes their cooking interesting is when they show you how they're messing with stuff. But the thing is they're all, not all, but most of them have a classical training that allows them to understand some of the core principles around the way ingredients work, the way ingredients play, what you can do, what you can't do. Now, those tenets may be wrong, right? And there are times when you'll kind of acknowledge that maybe that's not the right way to do stuff, and people will completely invert processes. But ultimately, if you take... There was something at Unilever which I always loved, which was called I think it was called rigorous creativity, and it was this idea that great jazz musicians and great dancers understood classical music or classical dance. They understood the tenets of the industry within which they operate, and I think that for brands, you need to understand the tenets of the industry, the dynamics of your category. Then you can break them. You can't break everything all at once, right? Because then the whole thing falls apart, right? So if you are a jam, right, you have to be sweet at some level, right? You have to produce a strawberry, right? You have to appeal to a certain kind of palate. You can't do something you can do something that's so different, but it's going to take the consumer quite a while to get there.
Rigorous creativity. I love this. So it's almost like, Jimi Hendrix has to learn how to play the guitar before he breaks the rules. I was listening to a podcast with Jimmy Carr, which was really good, the comedian Jimmy Carr. And he was saying how he wants to create a course where kids can learn how the comedy. And, we think of comedy and you're like, oh my God, there's a guy who just goes up on stage and they're funny. No. Again, back to rigorous creativity, is you are learning, as Jimmy Carr said, comedy is just pattern recognition. Like the beats of a joke are the same. A comedian has to do the reps on stage to get that drilled in, work out what the framework is. Are you a one punch kind of comedian like Jimmy Carr, or are you more of a storyteller like a John Bishop? Or are you crass like Kevin Bridges? Work out what the framework is, then break the rules. And I think, this is sick. This is amazing. I'm loving this. It's so true, because I think so many people go into it without doing that rigor up front. As you said, it's the biggest lesson from Unilever. Once you know that rigor, then you can break the rules.
So one of the weirdest, between Unilever and founding Great British Chefs, I ran a consultancy with a great friend who was a guy called Alistair Creamer.
Who's a good name.
Who still runs the consultancy. It's got a different name because there's a different partner nowadays. But we ran a creativity program for Mars. right? So Mars said, look, our communication isn't interesting enough. It's not dynamic enough. We need to become more creative, right? And we ran a program to help them look more intently, right? And the idea is that very few marketeers have been trained to actually analyze an image, right? So you look at an image and they're like, and you'll be like, oh, okay, I can see what's going on. But probably no one's ever sat you down and said, let's look at an image together. So I'm an art historian, right? And I'm a formalist art historian who trained to look at, Impressionists, the post-Impressionists, and modern art and all sorts of stuff. And I would sit in my classes week on week when I did my BA and my MA, and we would look at an image and we would try and understand what was going on and why had painters made certain choices and why did paintings make certain impacts and what drew your eye in and what didn't draw your eye in and what were the symbols and signifiers that were within the image that connected one story to another. And why did one image create outrage that you couldn't see today because everything had changed around it? And I think that we actually got an art historian, an amazing guy called Manu, who's a professor now at Harvard, Stanford. He came in and he taught these guys to look at paintings. And they all just kind of went, oh my God, I've never done this before. And it totally changed the way they looked at marketing materials. Because in the end, we spend lots of time talking about finance and strategy and all the rest of it, but actually we don't spend enough time at the other end of the creative process at really judging the visual impact of the work that we're doing. And it's one of my kind of, I have multiple obsessions, but, one of my obsessions is about getting the strategy right and getting stuff framed up and understanding consumers such that you can create brands. But then the other piece is around actually the texture and the communication of the visual. And are we doing a good enough job with that?
Is there an example to kind of bring that alive a bit with the texture piece? I think it's interesting.
I did a big piece of work with JWT, J. Walter Thompson. They are an advertising agency. They are one of the original kind of Mad Men agencies, right? Used to be based in Berkeley Square in the day. They're not anymore. And we basically work with Kellogg's. Now, if I say, think Kellogg's Special K, you are imagining a white bowl with some brown flakes in it and milk.
Yeah.
It is the definition of deprivation, of culinary boredom. And we were brought in as part of a multi-agency team. So there was JWT, there was ourselves, when I was a Great British Chefs, and Sign Salad, who are a semiotics agency. So they do the deep analysis of images and the signs and signifiers and why people react to things in different ways. Amazing agency, I love. But we all looked at this stuff and we started to analyze the food stories that Special K was telling. We tried to work out how to tell better stories because they had a brand vision which had nothing to do with their culinary product. And what we started
what was the mismatch you see of?
They were about strong women. The brand was moving from essentially diet and deprivation, right, to a story around strong women. And brand person there was ex-Dove, a really cool lady who basically had helped Dove on its evolution and then came in to evolve Special K, part of Kellogg's. And they had this vision around strong women and appealing to women who were achievers and were breaking rules rather than about diet and, sort of not eating and kind of ladies in red dresses, which is where Special K comes from a certain generation. And they tried to move Special K to an image which was actually about power and enjoyment and female empowerment. And they did that. So from a culinary perspective, you show a bowl of cereal with milk in it, that is not it, right? You show a multi-layered, multi-textural thing with yogurts and pomegranate seeds and the flakes being used as part of a mix with other things. And you suddenly get a bowl that is more handmade and is kind of clearly in a home environment rather than from a factory line. You start to tell a human story that's different, right? Two very different images, right? And I think that one of the things that I think in a lot of the food categories that are out there, there is so many things on social media in so many of these categories. How do you tell a good visual story? How do you create an image that is alluring, that is yours, that is owned, is a massive challenge for brands. And I suppose I'm really interested in the kind of the visual journey of helping brands define their kind of visual identity. And I think often it's one of those things that's forgotten.
Oh my God, I am so excited. It feels like Hungary is finally swimming in the big leagues. I can't believe this. It's absolutely mental. But delighted to announce that Big Fish, yes, Big Fish, are partnering the podcast. Perry's been on the podcast 3 times. Listeners absolutely love it. Some of our most downloaded and cherished episodes of all time. But Big Fish are behind literally so many brands in your cupboard, in your weekly shop. Charlie Bigham, Year Valley, Tyrrell's, Clipper Tea, Goo, Rana. I mean, mate, the list is longer than the River Nile. But they also share risk and invest in brands that they really believe are a force for good. They're brands that they believe are going to be the next big thing, like Howder, the snack that gives back. But even more exciting news, Big Fish want to speak to the next wave of small challenger food and drink brands that are destined for big things, the raconteurs, the movers, shakers, buccaneering visionaries. So look, if you want to speak to Big Fish and just have a chat, get your brand in front of them, then drop me a message. My mate Louis from Local Beer, Amazing Beer, was in their office, aka La Fish Bowl, last week chatting to Perry, Freddie and the Big Fish crew. So drop me a message if you would like to speak to them. Yeah, I think Rude Health just did a rebrand, and I think there was some talk about getting rid of the lips,
Right.
which is the infamous lips, and they brought a lady on I know who's a good friend of mine, actually, Tessa Stewart. I don't know if you've met her at all. Anyway, she's great. So she actually, in terms of getting to know your customers well, she will actually go and sit in a Sainsbury's and say, what do you think of this? Do you like it? Yes or no? Because I think another thing is brands, especially in London, can get in what I call a brand bubble, whereby they're so engulfed in the brand that they can't actually step out and see. You know, I always say you should go and do a meeting or an MPD meeting in a Tesco, like halfway in between Bracknell and some other place, right? Because that's where you'll see what. Oh, of course they don't want this. It's too niche, right? But anyway, she was saying that they were going to take off the lips, and Camilla, who is the founder, was like, absolutely not. That is the texture to the brand. It adds all these layers of texture. I think that's a great example. How let's explore the parallels between the history of art and analysing art and brand building. Again, we haven't even got onto food, but this is just so interesting. How can people listening to this? What's some of the lessons that you've picked up from to studying art to brand building that you think would be great for our listeners?
I often sit on the floor in galleries with my children. You'll see me sitting at that Tate Modern, Tate Britain, National Portrait Gallery, National Gallery, wherever it happens to be in London. And you sit down with them and you say, what do you see? What's in front of you? And I force them to play a little game to tell me what they notice, what do they discover, what's drawing them in, what's happening in the picture, how are you analysing it? And I think actually it's a muscle that we don't exercise very often. The art of looking and the art of analysing things visually. And I think there is, the next time you're walking tube in front of, or looking at a magazine or online, look at the image and go, why is this working? What's not working about it? What's distracting me? How is it kind of, just take a moment to stop and look and see what's happening. Why are you interpreting things a certain way? Try and look at the kind of the cues and the references that you're using. And look, I think your lip example is really interesting. I remember we did so when I launched Axe in North America, the brand director on that brand had recently repositioned a haircare brand called Finesse. And they changed the color of it, right? And it was either bright pink or bright blue. I can't remember which one it was. And they changed that color and sales collapsed. Like not like 5% drop, like 70% drop. Because people shopped for the pink one. And it was no longer there. It was a blue one and they just didn't see it, right? So I think, when you change brands, you have to be very careful. And I think, it's interesting. I didn't know where you were going to go with that lips thing, because what I thought you were going to say was when you spoke to consumers, actually they didn't care about the lips, they didn't even notice the lips. There are times when we think certain things are really important to consumers, but actually they're important to us. And I think there's that kind of classic game around trying to work out what are consumers latched onto and what are they not latched onto. one of the weirdest projects I did, the last project I did for Unilever UK before I went abroad, was migrating Jif to Cif. And it was a sort of an early attempt to look at European harmonization and the idea of brand name change, which was, utterly fascinating. And we spent months trying to work out how to communicate one letter change to consumers in a way that wouldn't lead to complete pandemonium. And at a time when the Daily Mail was going nuts about, Europe, straight bananas, round bananas, whatever it happened to be, kind of pints going, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea that we were going to change a brand like Jif to Cif was potentially kind of hugely dangerous. And it was all about understanding, actually with consumers, what did they care about? What do they not care about? How did you make them feel relaxed? How did you make them feel like the change was just not worth worrying about? And we came up with a campaign that made sure that no one batted an eyelid. And that was all about understanding consumers and what would upset them, what wouldn't. If you'd gone out and it was interesting, we had a moment where the ad agency said, we've got this it's like a celebration. Like, it's like, hey, the name's changing, let's celebrate this. And we were just like, no. We need to make the consumer feel like this is not important and they can handle it.
How did you do that?
So the ad was the two things which always stand out for me. One was a brand where lots of people were trying to pronounce Jif across Europe. And they were like, they were like this kind of not quite sure what it was. And then you see this UK consumer just pick up this bottle and be like, Cif, just walks off.
I remember this. Yeah. What year was this?
This was 2001. And it was an ad which was basically built upon the idea that the UK consumer, like, yeah, whatever.
I don't remember that then, because I was about 5 years old then.
So of the brands, so of the migration stories, it's one of the early ones, right?
Right.
And the other thing we did was we wrote to all the people we had on our database who we knew were the old, like over 60 consumers of Jif Cream, which is the original kind of format of Jif. And we gave them a kind of buy Cif and get a free Roses of Britain tea towel. So it's a tea towel with all the different types of roses on it.
Yeah.
I've never had a redemption rate like it. Handwritten letter signed from the chairman with a proper stamp on the front cover, Conqueror paper, went out. Amazing redemption rates. We understood the consumer, went on how to communicate with them, what they wanted, what their buttons were, what would appease them, and that's what we went after. And I think, when you're doing these kind of brand changes, you really have to understand the consumer, because otherwise you can make horrible errors.
How can challenger brands understand their consumer better? Like, what are the questions they should be asking? How do they do that?
For me, it's about non-leading questions. It's all about non-leading questions. Like, why are you buying that? What do you think about that? Why? It's actually just about playing the naive card, right? So, when I was in North America, I spent my time just traveling around, and because I have an English accent, people were like, you don't understand anything. And I'd be like, I don't really understand what's going on. Tell me something, right? And they would explain stuff in a really basic way, in a way that they probably wouldn't if they were talking to a fellow American.
Yeah.
And actually that ability just to kind of be like, just explain this to me, tell me more. And I do think that actually that sort of, I think too often, spending time at shelf, asking for, open questions, using systems like SurveyMonkey to kind of, get feedback from consumers. It's really not, honestly, my one challenge would be, if you are a brand and you have social media and you have a following and you haven't run a survey, make that the number one thing you do tomorrow. Because ultimately, just ask some questions. Which of the following words do you associate with this brand? When you look at this brand packaging, what are the words that spring to mind? Open field. Just those two things will tell you, is your brand communicating what you want to communicate?
So
which of the following 5 things, if you had to pick one, is most important to you, right? Is it B Corp? Is it, palm olive free? Is it no added sugar? Is it sustainably sourced? Is it, used by chefs? What is it that actually makes people go, I want this? This is not expensive. And one of the, in the old days, you had to book a focus group room, get a train moderator, you went behind a mirror. Truth is, just get out there, stand in the aisle, ask some questions, run some surveys online, and keep running them.
What you said there, and I love it, is founders. We talked about the brand bubble, which every founder gets in. The founder thinks about their brand
All the time.
24/7. The team think about their brand 24/7. They go to the same office every day. The little switch, what you said, could you be a foreigner? So I think if the founder says, right, I'm going to be a foreigner today to my brand, and just that reframe in your head, the way you go into that conversation, allows you to ask dumb questions.
Yeah.
Allows you to break down the kind of the tether from you to the brand and actually look at it slightly more further upstream, objectively, and that's where you can do the creative rigor.
And I think that there's always a benefit with being a category specialist, right? I think it's
Category specialist.
in terms of like, someone who's worked in soft drinks all their life, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't work in soft drinks. This doesn't work. They'll have that deep kind of understanding of the dynamics of the market, right? That's really important. But ultimately, you do need to ask the basic questions to understand what consumers think, what they're motivated by, how they value your brand. And I think it will always challenge, some of your assumptions. I mean, I do a lot of work for brands where, we run surveys, we try and do understanding, we try and look at what the brand's doing. And, that really, I think, helps understand what is true that you're right about and what isn't. And that doesn't mean, that's not, you take a brand that's an emerging challenger brand, it may not currently be communicating what you want it to communicate, maybe because your messaging isn't right. You're sharing all these things on social media, people may be liking them, but is it moving the brand forward? Right? And it's very easy to get that intelligence. If, you ask a few questions, you put a few visuals up, it's not expensive.
What other lessons did you take from being a historian of art and art to brand building?
I love stories. I'm all about, if you get me in a gallery and you ask me about a painting I love, I'll tell you a story about that painting. And so I took my kids around Tate Modern this weekend and we went to see, there was a photograph of the Raft of the Medusa. So the Raft of the Medusa, one of the most famous pictures in the Louvre, which is of this horrific raft of survivors of a crash, basically. They're people who were abandoned at sea after a ship went down, I think about 18 something. And I always forget whether it's by Rigour or Delacroix, but I think it's Delacroix. But I'd have to check. And essentially, I told the kids the story of what is this moment? What is this, what is the image that's shown is the people on the raft looking out onto the horizon because they think they've seen a ship that's going to save them, right? And it was painted in reaction to this horrific incident that was all over the French press. And the artist wanted to capture it to show complete outrage that this had been allowed to happen, that there weren't enough lifeboats on the ship, that the captain had abandoned these people, and that people had basically ended up as cannibals and were eventually saved. And he captures this moment in this pyramidal structure looking out towards where there is a moment of hope. And for me, great paintings tell stories that you kind of go, wow, that's really interesting. And I always remember as I came into Unilever and as I've kind of gone through and, all the work I've done is I love a story that captivates and that you can imagine. And that's always been it's why I founded Great British Chefs, because I thought there was an opportunity, a story to be told, something to inspire people about. And I think that for me is, the visual literacy piece and the importance of storytelling were probably the things I took out of it.
What brands do that best, do you think, in terms of getting the visual and the story to tell or sing together?
What brands do that best? I think brands are so inconsistent on this stuff, right? It's funny, you look at brands where, you look at things that have won awards, right? Big campaigns where you go, wow, that won an award. And I think then what happens is the next brand manager comes along and changes all of that, or changes to the next thing. I think where challenger brands can be so successful is that they can work out what story they want to tell is and then consistently tell it. And I think that's the kind of the thing that for me really interests me, is when you've got a brand that is able to consistently tell a story. So one of the most interesting brands I work with at the moment is Yumbug. So Yumbug is a a young startup. They're two cool founders who are basically trying to inspire people to eat insects as a protein. So mince, burgers, and strips. So kind of things you'd use in a stir fry. And the amazing thing about what they're doing is they're having to challenge people to completely unthink insects, right? Because insects are something we try and get out of our houses. They're scary. There's no positive connotation, in the kind of general narrative around insects, apart from the fact we need them to keep the planet stable. And they're doing an amazing job of trying to inspire people to eat insects. And it is all about storytelling. It's about working out how you tell a narrative of why should we eat insects? And it starts with, look, people have all around the world, people do eat insects all around the world, and they are more sustainable than basically anything else. And it's a really kind of, you can tell it in a way that's tongue in cheek. You can tell it in a way that's like, you're the weirdo for not eating insects. And they do a really nice job actually of telling that story. And they've got a pop-up just around the corner from here at the moment. And I think it's a really interesting example where they've got so many negatives, right, that they've done a great job of working out how to flip that into a kind of really interesting positive.
Know the framework, break the rules. I love that. The creative rigor. I love kind of following my curiosity. Why do you think humans are obsessed with art? Since the beginning of time, I
think we try and make sense of the world around us. I think in the end, there's a huge difference between, sketching and drawing and recording things around you. The two different questions. Why do people create and do art? I think it's a way of understanding the world around you and communicating what you're experiencing and feeling. It's one method, right? Not everyone uses it. I think great art is when artists tell incredible stories about their time in a way that kind of, a bit like a brand, condenses all of the thinking and shows you an image that just challenges and provokes you to think differently about the world in which you're in. I was interesting. So, we took a sabbatical with the kids and my wife and I went traveling around Latin America. And one of the things we did while we were there was we painted quite regularly. And I did art A level. Jesus, if I said, let's do a drawing competition, drawing scares me. I'm not good at drawing. I did printmaking. I did much more kind of bold, gestural kind of work. So drawing and painting is terrifying. My wife's amazing at it. I'm terrible at it. The kids are great at it. And actually, when you sit down and paint an image, you remember details that there's no way you would remember if you just sat there. So I was talking to the kids because this time last year we were in Argentina, right? And we were sitting in Valdez Peninsula, which is a peninsula off the coast of Argentina where there are about 1 million penguins. And we went to a place where there were 300,000 penguins and just wandered around. And we sat there and drew them. And I can see in my eye my daughter, who was 6 at the time, with her sketchbook drawing this penguin who was as far away from you are from me now. Mm-hmm. And I know if I said to her, draw that picture, she could draw it. And I could draw it. I can picture every single detail of it, because we sat there, we actually paid attention to that moment and that visual. And I think there's a real lesson in that for branding and communication is that, there is a need to really pay attention and to think deeply about, what you're communicating, how you're communicating, and, will it spark joy? Will it spark interest? And I think I was talking earlier about the idea of, the role of our history. So the act of looking and stopping and analyzing is really, really powerful. And it's not about being a good painter. It really isn't. You never, ever show any of the work I have never shared on any social media channel or to any of my friends, any of the 30 watercolors I did. And they got better over time, I will say. But it's not about that. I can picture the hills that we looked at in Argentina. I can picture the penguins we painted, the tortoises, like all that stuff that we kind of observed in a way that I wouldn't if you'd just taken a photograph.
I'm trying to, what you said there about kind of creating art to understand the world better. And then also, I think people go to galleries to understand or interpret the world better. And I've never studied the history of art, right? So I could be completely wrong here. But it feels almost potentially that like brands have spewed out of art in terms of, because I think ultimately we buy brands to understand the world better and to say something about ourselves, right? Yes. So for example, I only buy Nike Air Force One trainers. I've always done a weird kind of foible of mine, but they say something about me, like that just do it, that action orientated. It helps me understand the world better. So if you zoom out, maybe would you say that almost brands are an extension of art?
There's always been a huge relationship, most famously with Warhol, between art and brands, right? And obviously, Warhol and the Campbell Soups, lots of artists have worked in the commercial space at various times, and lots of artists comment on the commercial world, both positively and negatively. I certainly think that, we delude ourselves slightly if we think that every brand we buy is a reflection of ourselves.
Yeah, I agree with that.
There are some brands or some purchase decisions, I will say, because I don't think loyalty is a foregone conclusion. There are certain purchase decisions we make that are designed to reflect who we are as people. That is 100% clear. But I do think there are times when brands delude themselves into thinking that every purchase decision is about who we are as people. And if you actually look at your own purchasing, you will realize how inconsistent you are in terms of your values, right? Because, if you take sustainability as an idea, right? What percentage of what you buy is truly sustainable, right? There will be certain brands you buy, they don't use palm oil, or they're produced in the UK. And then at the same time, you buy, let's say, a famous brand like Coca-Cola, which is,
Just gonna put this on charge, yeah.
massively destructive environmentally. And I think there is a game here whereby, some purchase decisions are actually about fulfilling a need at that moment in time in order to help you move through the day, right? I need a coffee. I need, I need to pick up some more oats, right? I want to get some milk, right? Some decisions are you just purchase stuff. Some brands you will be like, oh yeah, I like that brand. But, price plays a big role. And very few people are completely loyal to one brand in any category. I mean, you think about it, right?
Yeah.
There's certainly I might always have Marmite in my cupboard because I like Marmite and there is no replacement. But, I've got, a number of different jams. I've got a number of different, things I pick up in different places. I'm not brand loyal to many food stuff, partially because as a foodie, I want interest. And I do think that's one of the kind of conundrums that food brands face, is that if your target audience is foodie, how do you make sure you're part of that interest? How do you drive ongoing engagement?
Let's talk about Great British Chefs. As we said, kind of it was a tipping point in the zeitgeist that has changed the way now, looking back, how we think about food, how we think about chefs. Let's go back one step and almost look at the framework you were trying to break. Like, what was your why for creating Great British Chefs? Like in 2008, what was the feeling? Why did you do this?
So a simple idea, which is we felt that chefs had incredible knowledge of how to cook better food, but no one gave them a platform to do that. And we felt there was lots of content emerging that was from people who had big profiles on TV, who were kind of self-taught and knew lots of stuff, but we felt there was a missing opportunity to get the real experts to tell people how to really create great food. And our argument was no one knows how to create food better than the people who day in, day out are cooking the greatest food in this country. And we went out to find 12 chefs to begin with. And we created an iPhone app for Apple. And we deliberately targeted chefs across the UK. So we had Nathan Outlaw down in Cornwall. We had people like Martin Wishart in Edinburgh. We had Simon Hulston down in Torquay. We deliberately didn't have 12 chefs in London. We could have done. There were, hundreds of chefs in London who were brilliant. But we wanted to tell a story about the food in Britain. And the story that people like Simon Hulston would be telling from a seafood perspective, or Nathan Outlaw would be telling from a seafood perspective, or what Martin Wishart would be telling from Scotland, was fundamentally different to what was happening in the capital. And so from the very beginning, we started with those 12 chefs. And by the time I left in 2019, we must have had, well over 150. We launched Great Italian Chefs as well, which was 50 of Italy's greatest chefs. And what we wanted to do was to tell the story of each of those chefs through both better information about them and also through the recipes that they were creating. And we basically went into an SEO war with BBC Good Food, Jamie Oliver, Delia Nigella, and spent, pretty much 10 years building a community of over 1 million followers across all our platforms and unique visitors of over 2 million on a monthly basis. And we did that through a rigorous understanding of SEO and a content strategy which was nothing short of, militant in how focused we were. And what we did was we just decided what keywords we wanted to own, what recipe areas we wanted to own, and we built the content to win those wars. So we had, we'd take a single protein, we'd explode that protein, we would make sure that we had all the landing pages, all the content that would essentially mean that when someone searched for, salmon recipes, something very basic, we'd be there in the top 5 because we had a really strong range of salmon recipes that were all different, they were all complementary. And we would then have starter salmon recipes and easy salmon recipes, dinner party salmon recipes, sous vide salmon recipes. But we built out content in a really granular way. And we basically made sure that people found us. And the people who found us were by definition foodies, because we created content for scallops and monkfish and sous vide and, all sorts of techniques and ingredients that you would only cook if you were a foodie. And so we had this kind of self-built funnel that every day new people came onto our site based upon a certain block of content that would appeal to them, right? You don't search for scallop recipes unless you know how to cook, right? You don't search for pheasant recipes or pigeon recipes or rabbit recipes. And because we were never publishing a magazine, every time we added content, we go and see a chef, we go, we need a few more duck recipes, or have you got any venison recipes? We get a bit more venison, and we seem to be lacking in this area. So we just kept bringing in chefs based upon where our content holes were. So the content just grew in a way that was completely strategic from an SEO perspective. Whereas all the poor people who were having to publish magazines every month needed to come, hey, here's the next turkey recipe. Once we had our perfect roast turkey recipe, we didn't need another one. That was our turkey recipe. Right? So we then added all the outliers to allow us to basically just keep building the most diverse recipe content database that we could have. We then optimized it in order to make sure we were found. And it began as a content-led business where we were charging money for buying our apps. Very quickly became clear that that was not the business model. And because people in those days didn't pay for content. And they still don't really pay for content. Yeah. It's very hard. And so we moved to a brand sponsorship model, and we had strategic partnerships with one brand in every category we identified. So we basically had a matrix of all the categories that we wanted a brand partner. So, in pasta, we had Barilla. In rice, we had Tilda. In tonic water, we had Fever Tree. In Chinese, we had Chinese ingredients. We had Lee Kum Kee. We had strategic partnerships in travel. We had strategic partnerships in insurance. We had strategic partnerships in literally every single block, Irish beef and lamb, Alaska seafood, then Norwegian salmon. We had different people, Willie's Cacao, you could literally go through the grid. We had a grid and we knew we needed a brand in each box. And they were our partners and they owned the content in those areas. So when someone searched for, duck recipes, it said, choose Gressingham, right? When you hit an olive oil recipe, it said, well, obviously choose Filippo Berrio. It's the best, right? So we had this way of basically making sure that brands could own the premium content online. And so we built a model which is, to begin with, brand partnership driven. We then did a load of research. So we were running 2 surveys a year for about 4 years, where we tried to understand the 14 million people who are foodies in the UK. We would give webinars before webinars were a thing. And we'd have 300-400 people come online to hear about brand people, to hear about what was happening in the world of food, what was changing, and we had the data. So we'd run national research, we'd sort of have nationally, we would then have Great British Chefs research, we'd overlay the two in order to understand.
And would you charge for that? Was that a way to monetize?
No, so if you were a brand partner of ours, we gave people deep insight into what was happening with their audience and what they believed and what they were thinking, and we then sold the advertising and the brand partnerships off the back of it. We used it as a biz dev tool. So it's a biz dev tool, and we use that to go and speak to people and go, right, here's what's happening. Here's not what's happening.
What was the hardest? Because I've now got 4 sponsors for the podcast, which is great. But getting the sponsors was like, well, I mean, it's amazing. I get to use GS1's office now. It's brilliant. But I know how hard it was getting the first one. Like I was pitching to maybe 20, 30 pitches just to get one sponsor, loads of no's. What was that moment in time, that almost that trough of sorrow, which I like to say, that moment of time when you're in the trenches? Like, talk to me about that period. What was that like?
So there was an amazing meeting. Still picture it. I drove up to Ocado with my COO, a guy called Tim Rosenberg, a great guy, and still a good friend. And we drove up to see Jason Gissing, one of the founders of Ocado. We managed to get a meeting with him through hook or by crook. And we got in there, and there was a principle that I'd been taught, which was, if you're trying to do something, make it real, right? Bring it to life. So we had this meeting with Jason. We told him the story of Great British Chefs. We told him, about the fact that what we were about was about creating recipes that were just better than any other recipe you've had. So if we had a recipe, it was just better, right? Because it was cooked by a chef. A chef knew how to do it. They knew how to make that recipe special. And so I brought to that meeting a chocolate sorbet that I'd made myself. It's a Bocca di Lupo recipe by Jacob Kennedy. And we ate that sorbet in the meeting. And we brought it to life. And Jason was like, you guys are crazy. Love what you're doing. Let's do something. And we didn't try and make it too real, but we made it real enough that he could see what we were talking about. And we brought a little bit of magic into that meeting. And that was the first deal we ever got with Ocado. Ocado and Bart's were literally about the same time. And I remember at that moment in time that I knew if we hadn't got that deal, I wasn't convinced I'd be able to convince the funders to keep going. Because we'd found some super annoying thing that the accountant had screwed up and messed up our VAT calculation. And there was suddenly a 30 grand hole in the business. And I'm like, oh my God, what's happening? And, the moment where it was really kind of, as all startup owners will know, there are moments where things are really rocky. And it was one of those rocky moments. And I knew as I left that meeting that we were going to be okay. But, I put everything into that meeting. And that's one of the things I love. I love those meetings that are really binary. Right, it's the ultimate kind of gambling moment where you've got to somehow pull everything out and make it work. And preparing for those meetings is a real, I think it's one of the great joys.
Yeah, we had a similar thing so I'll send you some samples for a brand called Islands Chocolate. I don't know if you've heard of Islands. So they're in loads of Michelin restaurants. Yep. They're used by Gordon Ramsay uses it in his restaurant. Heston Blumenthal, Tom Kerridge, loads of Michelin chefs. We position ourselves as the chef's chocolate. But the subject line to Ocado was fresh. It was in November time last year. Fresh cookies, warm hot chocolate. That was the subject line. I was like, could we come in and give you some fresh cookies? So we go in with this hot chocolate machine, freshly baked cookies, and then the listing goes live this week. Very serendipitous. I want to talk about What's one chef you've worked with so many that is sort of was so impressive it changed the way you viewed the world?
Impossible. I mean, we worked with over 100, closely, and the early founders will always be, those first 12 will always have a special place in my heart. But there are so many that I've had so many great experiences with over the years that there will always be, I remember going out to see Nathan Outlaw for the first time, first chef to get 2 Michelin stars for a fish-only restaurant, remains one of the great restaurants in the country. He remains one of the great chefs in the country. Nathan will always be kind of extraordinary. Marcus Waring, one of those real signature chefs, but, Tom Aitken, all those guys, Nuno Mendes, Alfred Prasad, one of the first chefs to get a Michelin star from an Indian restaurant. Martin Wishart up in Edinburgh, again, breaking all the rules for kind of, Scottish food. Lisa Allen, up at Northcote. There's a whole, there's so many. And the thing is, there's so much great food. And one of the things actually I do, which I love, is every year I organise a dinner for the NSPCC, which is in about a month's time, I think a month's time today, which is we raise £300,000 on one evening for Childline, and we get to bring 5 chefs to the room. And over the years, we've had all the great chefs from outside London come and cook. I think famously we had Sat Baines come, who always has a spoon in his top pocket. Yeah. It's a very flat spoon. It's closer to being a knife than it is a spoon. And he had it in his top pocket, and the auctioneer kind of spotted it, and they ended up auctioning the spoon for £1,000 for a laugh. And it was like one of those, for Childline, sort of moments. But what I love about those chefs is that they are all highly entrepreneurial. They're all passionate about what they do. They work so hard. And, the truth of the matter is that every day a new group of people walk into that restaurant. If that food isn't great that day, they don't stand for anything. Bad reviews that day, etc. Every day has to be brilliant. It's one of the most brutal industries I can think of. And I have so much respect for those guys who work day in, day out to create amazing food. And it was an honor to cook with some of them, to eat at many of their restaurants, and to learn from them and be able to tell their stories.
What are some of your favourite restaurants?
Do you know, I always jokingly say that my wife and I have what we call culinary ADD, which is we just never go back to the same place because it's just too much. And we have 2 young children who complain every time we go out. I think, we are constantly trying new places, going to new places. I recently subscribed to Vittles, which I love, which is, some people think it's quite pretentious, but it's like off the beaten track restaurants. We went to a place yesterday, which was it was basically a supermarket in Walthamstow that just had, absolutely amazing Sri Lankan food. And we brought it home, right? It's hard. My wife's Sri Lankan, right?
Yeah.
So we spend a lot of time in Sri Lanka when we can. I go there once every 2 years. And we had amazing Sri Lankan food. It was an off the beaten track place in the middle of Walthamstow. We walked in, we spent £100 on ingredients for our cooking and stuff for and a takeaway, which was just amazing. Kottu and chicken curry and all sorts of aubergine and idlis and all sorts of incredible stuff. So we're always just looking out for new places and discovering new places. So it's not, we literally don't have a single place we go back to regularly.
What is the one that you've been to like twice or 3 times?
So there's always, so the only of the big Michelin stars I've been to a number of times have been Nathan's, because it's in Cornwall, and if ever I'm down there, I will make that.
You've been to Cornerstone Tom
Yes,
Brown.
So Tom Brown.
Just worked for him.
So Tom Brown amazingly cooked at my wife's 40th at our house.
Oh, really?
He's an amazing chef. Amazing.
Yeah.
You see, I've been there twice. I haven't been there for probably 4. I went there when it opened, the day it opened.
Yeah.
Before it opened, Tom came and cooked my wife's 40th. And I think he's an incredible chef.
Yeah.
But I haven't been back there, right? And we drop in and out of places. I think we're more likely to go back for a very specific type of ethnic food that we love that I need to have, like I'll need to have every now and then an amazing ramen. So I live in Islington, Canada Yao, the ramen there is completely world class, right? So when I need a really good ramen, I will sneak into Canada Yao. It's actually those sorts of places that I find myself kind of like, a friend of ours owns Columba Kitchen in just off Regent Street. And again, we will go back there for certain dishes. So I think we kind of return to kind of for dishes and cuisines more than we do restaurants.
What are some lessons from chefs? As you said, chefs are entrepreneurs or very entrepreneurial. That is applicable to founders, food like brand founders.
I think the culture in restaurants has changed a lot, right? There's a big project called the Burnt Chef Project. There's, the industry is an industry which has had, a complex relationship, I would say, with substance abuse, a complex relationship with gender equality, a complex relationship with looking after the mental health of their employees. I think restaurants have changed a lot in the last 20 years in terms of the way that people work in kitchens and the environment they create in kitchens. I think they have learnt over time the need to create a real sense of family and a real sense of shared community. And I think they are now much better at that. I think they are really good at acknowledging that every day is a new day. As I said earlier, every day is a new day where someone tries a dish for the first time. They've heard, the cod with chicken, roast chicken at Tom Brown's place is amazing. Well, they've heard about it. They've read about it on Instagram. They've read the review. But when they walk in, that's the one time they're going to eat it. And I think that lesson of like every dish has a different consumer. Every dish is served once, on that day. That moment is special. I think that is something that at times when we're running a fast-moving consumer product where you're selling thousands and thousands of things, actually you can forget that fact that in the end it boils down to one consumer buying your product, sitting down at home and trying it. And chefs don't forget that because the person is just out there.
I think one of my obsessions, and I think where brands under-index, is sampling. You can get these agencies to do it, but my whole belief is that moment is like, it can be make or break for a brand, and the sampling needs to be almost like a chef or a waiter at a restaurant giving that experience to someone. If you can do that as a sampling session as a brand.
And I think that's a really interesting one, because actually I think sampling is a great place where you can tell great stories. You get, we were talking earlier about, consumer feedback, being up and close with consumers. You can get that kind of, that proximity to your customer base. And you do realize, when you hand over that sample and they go, yeah, it's not for me, that's real feedback, right? And I think actually there's some really interesting stuff being done about alternative business models around sampling, whereby actually brands taking stalls in various places and pop-ups, you can make those cost neutral if you run them right. And I think there are ways in which you can make giving consumers, building that community, getting people to try your stuff, really a great way of doing stuff.
We'll wrap this up in a sec, but I've loved this, Ollie. How would you make it cost neutral? Because I know with islands, is a lot of people want to under-index their spend on sampling. They think we'll get an agency, and there's nothing that winds me up more than you go into a store, an amazing brand, and you see a student who's on their phone. Yeah. And it's just that really winds me up. And it's, how would you make it cost neutral?
So I think sampling in retail is never cost neutral unless you get the right promotional activity and you look at the total P&L of having that listing, and therefore it's an investment to deliver the return in the medium term. I think there are good examples where people are building, let's say Yumbug, right? Really good example. They've done a pop-up. It's lasted 3 or 4 weeks. People have paid, 100 quid for dinner for two to eat insects, right? It's a great brand building thing. They put opinion leaders in. They put people they want to talk to about it. They've worked with other brands they really like. They've raised their profile. They've got PR. People have written about them. And the cost of the ingredients, the staff, and everything else is paid for by people sitting down and eating that meal. Right now, that's a one-off example. Could you do a chocolate-themed restaurant, the same thing, where people pay to experience the brand? Yeah, you probably could, right? This been done before. So I think there are ways in which you can build retail experiences that cover their costs.
let's leave that there. Yeah, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
No problem. Great to
Appreciate
chat.
that.
No problem.